Hi, Josh here with my games played in February of 2026. I have 6 board games to talk about, all of which, once again, are brand new to me, mostly, and I even liked a couple of them, so I'm going to get into that in a second. First, I'll talk about the video games. The first one I will mention here is Enshrouded, which as of the end of February I had 125 hours of playtime into, so, you know, pretty much every day I keep coming back to it, and just when I start to get a little bored with the game, I explore this giant world that the game takes place in a little bit more and discovered an entirely new biome with new plants and environment and wild new animals and all this stuff, and I get hooked right back into it, so continuing to enjoy it. My rating remains the same at 9 out of 10. The other game that I now have enough playtime into to give a rating to, I have 2.5 hours into Circuit Superstars, and I actually have a little bit more playtime than that in another game called Age of Empires 4, although I'm really not sure what to think of that game yet, so I haven't sat down to rate it. But in terms of Circuit Superstars here, now that my controller actually works for the game, I find myself coming back to it every once in a while to knock off a few races, and it's a game where the artwork is very cartoony, and it's done with this sort of angled top-down isometric viewpoint, and so everything about it looks very arcadish, but they actually have clearly tried to make pretty realistic physics in the game, and it's actually a pretty hard game to play. Even with all the computer racers' skill levels turned down to the lowest setting, I've only won a single race so far, and more often than not, I finish in the bottom 6 out of 12 racers on the track, so it's pretty challenging, and I suppose it's good that it's not too easy, but it is fun that over time I get to unlock different car types, so they have a really interesting assortment everywhere from your simple F1 style race car to these trucks that are big rig cabs and a bunch of stuff in between, and you unlock new tracks that initially you start on your basic asphalt race tracks, and then you get some dirt tracks with jumps into play, and you have some that are a combination of both asphalt and dirt, and so you can play with the appropriate cars on the appropriate tracks. You can have an off-road buggy on your dirt tracks or a rally car on the asphalt and dirt tracks, and so it's fun to try out different stuff, and it's fun just to sit down and, like I said, knock off a few races in an evening. I rate the game 7.5 out of 10. Definitely recommend it if you're into that sort of thing and are up for a bit of a challenge. Before I get into the board games here, I just want to send out a thank you to my Patreon supporters. I have gained a new supporter, so I want to send out a huge thank you to Adam, who jumped in right at the $10 level here, which is really generous. And to be honest with you, by about the end of January this year, I was feeling really burned out on YouTube after near the 8 years of doing this, and was having a hard time finding the motivation to keep doing it, but this has really lit a fire of motivation for me, and I just want to thank Adam and all my other Patreon supporters for allowing this to continue to be a thing for me. I am a little bit embarrassed, though, when I look back at the support levels I created in my Patreon. They really, at this point, bear no relation to reality, so I really need to go back and into Patreon and edit those support levels to something that means something, and so I do apologize for the nonsense that those actual levels are, but you know, for the people that do take the time to support me at any level, it really means a lot to me. So diving into the board games now, I'm going to go in order of lowest rated to highest rated as usual, and we're gonna the first 2 games are my lowest rated games, but they are both games that are massively popular on BoardGameGeek. So amongst the really serious board game hobbyists, both of these games are rated 7.6 out of 10 on BoardGameGeek, and really anything above 7.5 out of 10 on BGG is a really high rating. That's really getting into the truly upper stratosphere of the BoardGameGeek ranking system there. So all that to say, you should never really take my word for whether a game is good or not, because my tastes tend to really not overlap with the general tastes of the board gaming community. A large part of that is my lack of interest in playing very complex Euro-style games with a pasted-on theme that are really more of a spreadsheet exercise than an actual creation of a narrative on the table, if you know what I mean by that. And I would actually go so far as to argue the fact that high complexity in a board game is often an indication of poor editing and development. So just like with a novel, when the novel is written, the editors need to come in there and really strip away all the fluff and keep that core story strong and moving along at a good pace. I really feel like the same thing needs to happen with board game developers. They really need to strip away, I think, more things and keep the core fun of the game. And high complexity, to me, often indicates bad game design. And I know that could be a hugely controversial statement given the popularity of these very complex games. And having said that, I do have a couple of very complex games amongst my top favorite games of all time, like Gloomhaven and War of the Ring. And in those instances, the complexity is there to bring out as much of the theme as possible. With a game like War of the Ring, you got all of these special rules so that you can really feel this living world of War of the Ring with all its unique characters and all its unique factions. So that's why those particular games work for me. But for the most part, I do tend to gravitate towards the medium to light medium weight games that, you know, even with a very lightweight game, you can have a surprising amount of thematic integration with very few rules. And I tend to bring up a game like K2 as an example of this, where the game is super simple to learn and yet incredibly thematic, incredibly tense and enjoyable to play. So that's just an introduction to why these first couple games on my list are rated as low as they are, even though they are extremely popular on BoardGameGeek. And in fact, this first game here, Boonlake, I think is in the top 500 games of all time on BGG, which is a very, very highly ranked game. Now, I describe Boonlake as a Euro-y Euro of Euro-ness with a weird theme of Wild West robots, but don't worry, the theme doesn't matter because it's all about the mechanisms of the gameplay, just as with most good Euro games. Now, to be fair, this is a similar situation to what I had in the month of January, where I really overdid it with both my mental and physical both my mental and physical chronic health problems. You know, there's that old spoon theory, which I get tired of hearing, but I do have a limited amount of energy, and I have been overdoing it a little bit because with Boonlake, for example, by the time I got to this game on the table, I was about 6 hours into a game day, and I had already learned and played 3 new-to-me games, Black Forest, Ginkgopolis, and Paleo. And so I was already very tired, very mentally fried, and when we were about halfway through the rules explanation learning Boonlake, I realized I had made a terrible mistake by not calling it a night and going to bed, but I hung in there for the sake of the group. And because, truthfully, I was enjoying the company I was with, so that part was nice. But I soldiered on with 2 other players, so we played a 3-player game. They had both previously played the game, whereas, like I said, it was new to me, and so I did my best to keep up. And my little game engine got off to a fairly slow start in the beginning, but by mid-game, it went roaring ahead, and I leapt way ahead on the score track somehow. But then, in the last few turns of the game, my game engine completely sputtered out and died, and I ended the game a very distant 3rd place out of 3. The game's winner had 278 victory points, and I had 182, so I was way behind by game end. Of course, like I always say, winning or losing the game has very little to do with how much I enjoy a game in particular. Boonlake certainly has some interesting intertwining mechanisms going on that provide a good mental workout for people who prefer puzzling over mechanisms to creating an interesting narrative, like I said. And there was actually a little bit of overlap with Clans of Caledonia's mechanisms and the overall feel of the game, I thought. But I actually much preferred Clans of Caledonia's theme and gameplay overall, even though it didn't stick around in my collection because it wasn't the type of game that would really get played hardly at all, probably. So overall, I rate Boonlake 5 out of 10, and it confirmed yet again that these heavier Euro-style games just aren't for me. Similarly then, moving on to Black Forest, I had requested that we give this one a try because the cover, the game box, looked interesting, and I had recalled hearing good things about the game. But then when I learned that this game was based on Glass Road, my heart sank a little bit because my very vague memory of playing Glass Road one time years ago was that it was just another fiddly really overly complex Euro-style game. But then later on, after I had played Black Forest, I looked up my BGG rating and comments for Glass Road, which I wrote after playing the game in 2014 one single time. I was very surprised to see that I had rated Glass Road 7.5 out of 10 at the time, though I had stated that it was more for the quality of the game design than my actual personal enjoyment at the time, because back then I used to divide my 10 out of 10 rating into 5 points for the actual game design and then 5 for my personal enjoyment. So it got high marks for the game design, but fairly low marks for my enjoyment of the game. Now, in comparing Black Forest and Glass Road, when it comes to tabletop games in general, I tend to prefer dynamic movement on a game board over action that is mostly directed by card play. So in theory, I enjoy Black Forest more than Glass Road, even though, like I said, my memory of the latter is pretty hazy. But ultimately, I found Black Road to be just another fiddly, overly complex, and fairly uninspiring Euro exercise of acquiring resources and then converting resources into other things to then convert those things into points. So rather than rate Black Forest higher than 7.5 out of 10, which I had given Glass Road, I probably need to go back and drop my rating of Glass Road, because ultimately I gave Black Forest a 5.5 out of 10. Like I said, it's a clever enough design that definitely worked well for 3 players, and I enjoyed the dynamic board movement part of it, and I can definitely see why it is popular amongst the sorts of gamers who enjoy these fairly abstract, puzzly Euro games, but it wasn't really my cup of tea. Moving on next to a game called 1998 ISS, which stands for International Space Station. This game is part of the 1900 series of games by Looping Games, a publisher that has, I think, 10 games in this series of games that have a year from the 1900s in the title, and they have very different themes, and they all come in these small boxes. So this one does have an interesting, although somewhat weirdly implemented theme, where players are competing with each other to build the International Space Station, and they are doing this by sending up materials and astronauts, expanding with new modules on the space station, and researching science up there. But weirdly enough, it doesn't actually matter where you put the new modules you build on the station. They're mostly there just to be a functioning space to put your astronauts. So the actual building of the station has no interesting element to it. It does feel like there's a decent amount of game in that small box, while at the same time it's pretty easy to learn and everything flows together fairly well. The only thing, in my opinion, of the game is missing is fun. At the end of it, I was like, okay, it all works together pretty well, but where's the fun? Where's the enjoyment coming from? And the answer was, for me, nowhere. I rate the game 5.5 out of 10 as being kind of a decent, interesting design, but although I wouldn't necessarily want to come back to this particular game, it certainly wouldn't stop me from trying any of the other games in this particular series. Now we have Ginkgopolis, and this is the one game that I have played one time previously. This was about a dozen years ago, probably not long after the game came out in 2012. So I did have one previous play, although my extremely vague memory of the game was that I thought it was an interesting design that didn't actually play as well as I was hoping it would. That's sort of this fuzzy memory I had sitting in my head. But despite that maybe not entirely positive memory, when I saw that my friend had this game, I jumped at the chance to try it again, especially given the fact that this has been a grail game amongst the board gaming community for a long time due to its lack of availability, but its overall popularity, I guess, went back when it was available. So a lot of people are seeking this out, and so I was really happy to give it a try. And really, it is a very clever design with a fairly straightforward rule set, but really quite thinky gameplay. I played it with 3 players, which I think is the sweet spot, because the constantly changing board state makes for a very tactical game where trying to plan ahead in a more strategic fashion is pretty pointless. Now, since it is an area majority game, the gameplay is pretty cutthroat. So on the one hand, that's a refreshing change of pace from the more multiplayer solitaire Euro-style games. On the other hand, it can leave people feeling a little less than happy if they get shut out of an area at some point. because of that, it's probably best played with friends who get a kick out of stabbing each other in the back rather than with people you don't know very well like I did, although, I still enjoyed the play. I rated it 6.5 out of 10 and overall thought it was a decently interesting game that I would definitely play again, but I wouldn't necessarily seek it out, and I certainly wouldn't be amongst the people who would consider it to be a grail game that you need to track down somewhere. And now we get into the two games that were hits for me that I did quite enjoy. The first one is New Frontiers. Now this is part of a series of games designed by Thomas Lehman, and it started off with the release of Race for the Galaxy in 2007 and then Roll for the Galaxy in 2014, which I'm pretty sure I've played a few times in the past, but I never bothered to rate it or record it on BGG. Then after that, Jump Drive was released in 2017, which I did own for a little while and thought was decent, but not good enough to stay in the collection. And then finally, we have here New Frontiers, which came out in 2018. The only one I have not played is the original Race for the Galaxy, which I believe is also the most popular game in the series. To this day, it remains a very highly rated, very popular game. Oh, I do have my rating of Jump Drive recorded, which I gave a 6.5 out of 10 to Jump Drive. Anyhow, I enjoy New Frontiers the most of the three that I've played. I love the physical production of the game with your tableau of planets and your upgrade tiles and the wildly overproduced plastic resource cubes that are just outrageous but so satisfying to play with. I enjoy trying to put together one or two specific game engines that gain points through specific combos, though it did feel like the game ended before I could really kick off with any of them. I guess the good part of that is the game definitely doesn't overstay its welcome. Instead, like I said, I kind of found myself wishing it was a little bit longer. Now, the true test of my enjoyment is that this big, beautifully produced game that I did enjoy playing is currently on sale at the Board Game Bliss online retail game store for $15 Canadian, plus taxes and $10 shipping in my case. But after going to the site, putting the game in my cart there, and trying to find other games that I wanted to purchase from the site to put together a little game order, I ended up not finding anything else that I wanted to purchase. I mentioned previously that I'm really trying to actually downsize my game collection instead of gain more games, so I'm really picky about what I pick up at this point. And ultimately, I decided not to pull the trigger on New Frontiers, so even at $15 plus $10 shipping, I wasn't willing to pick up this particular game and add it to my own collection, although I would definitely play it again. I rate it 7 out of 10. Certainly a neat little Tableau engine building game that I would recommend for people who enjoy that sort of thing. Now finally, my number one game of the month was a cooperative board game called Paleo. Now, as you probably know if you watch my channel, I'm a sucker for prehistoric themes. So if you mix that with an easy-to-learn cooperative game with great artwork and components, obviously I'm going to be all in on this one. So now at the beginning of this board game discussion, I talked about complexity and how it can be used to bring out a game's theme, and yet there are games that use very few rules and really successfully bring out the theme. So in the case of Paleo, it falls into the latter category where the rules are very simple and yet every aspect of the design brings the theme to life in a very real and tangible way. So everything from the different card backs that give the players the feeling of exploring in different biomes and areas of the world, to the resolution of certain event cards that lead to specific effects taking place. This is a living world full of dangers and occasional rewards for your little tribe of cave people. What's really great about the gameplay is how closely players need to work together and truly cooperate in order to achieve success. This is definitely not one of these multiplayer solitaire situations, though of course this is also the sort of thing that could lead to your typical quarterbacking or alpha player problem that a lot of co-ops do have, if you have one or more people at the table who are not necessarily team players and who want to run the show. But our little group of 3 players did ended up working together very well. We pulled off a victory on the first module, even though I've been told that the game is quite difficult. And what's cool about the game is that it continues forward, apparently, in this campaign-like progression. I'm not really exactly sure how it works, but I would love to keep playing through the modules, and depending on how those go, there's a potential for my rating of the game to go up even further from the 8 out of 10 that I do give the game. So this is just based, like I said, on playing the first module one time. And so even though I am currently actively trying to shrink my game collection, like I mentioned, this is one that has gone on my must-have wish list. This is a title that I'm on the lookout for. It doesn't seem to be currently available, at least here in Canada, but I'll be keeping an eye on it. One concern I do have is that if this does end up being a very difficult co-op game as you progress through the modules, and it doesn't have ways to adjust the difficulty level up or down, I'm not sure if it does or not, but if this means you're just getting beaten down by bad luck based on how cards are coming up, it might not be a great one to play with my kids necessarily, and thus might not be worth owning after all. But in terms of my first impressions, it does seem like a game that I would enjoy having, both from a gameplay perspective and the physical production of the game, which has, I mean, the physical production is great. It has this great 3D tile holder thing and everything, so it's a great looking game. I had fun with the first initial impressions of it, and I would love to explore it some more. And that wraps up my games played in the month of February. As always, I love to hear what you're playing. I'm especially interested in hearing what games you've been enjoying a lot lately, or if there are any upcoming titles that you're looking forward to that I should be checking out. Another big part of the motivation for me to continue with this YouTube channel are the great conversations I have with people in the comments. And if it was just me talking into space here, it wouldn't be necessarily worth continuing with this YouTube channel. So yeah, I love chatting with you. I appreciate the people who take time to comment, but I also do appreciate those of you who just take the time to watch my video, and it's just nice to have you here. Cheers. Hi, I'm Josh. Hi, Josh here with my games played in February of 2026. I have 6 all new. Hi, Josh here with my games played in February of 2026. I have 6 board games that once again are all brand new to me for the most part. Hi, Josh here with my board games. Hi, Josh here with my games played in February of 2026. With a weird theme of Wild West robots. Now, to be fair, this is a similar situation to I had to playing Boonlake. I am especially interested in hearing what games have been